Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Tim Ogden. I'm the Managing Director of the Financial Access Initiative at NYU Wagner. And we have partnered with the Center for Financial Services Innovation on the U.S. Financial Diaries project, and we're very pleased to be here at long last to be able to present some of those early findings. We've been sharing some limited analysis for the last year, looking at some of our households and some specific issues. But finally, this fall, we got to the point of having a complete and clean data set so that we could start looking at the big picture. And that's what Jonathan Morduck and Rachel Schneider, co-principal investigators of the project, are going to be sharing this morning. It's been about 4.5 years since we started the conversations about doing the U.S. Financial Diaries project, when on the heels of the book Portfolios of the Poor, the Ford and Citi Foundations came to FAI and CFSI and said, why don't we do this in the United States? And we said, because it would be way too hard and way too expensive. And they said, try. Shortly thereafter, Omidyar Network got word they were going to try this, and they said, yes, you are going to try. You're going to do this. And so I want to recognize them today because not only did they sort of kick this off, but they've shown immense patience and grace over the course of what it takes to do a research project this broad, this long-lasting, and we think really this groundbreaking. So specifically want to recognize Frank DiGiovanni and Chris Bishko, Frank from the Ford Foundation, Chris from Omidyar Network, and Graham McMillan from Citi Foundation, who are here today, and thank them for their steadfast support in getting to this point. And thank you, Tillman, for being a cheerleader. A couple of technical notes. We are live streamed today, so I want to welcome the people who are watching us online. For those of you in the room, you'll see there's a Wi-Fi details there if you'd like to get online. If you are a tweeting kind of person, we have a hashtag. But I also especially want to encourage everyone to visit the U.S. Financial Diaries site, sign up for our research alerts. This is the opposite of spam. It is not a newsletter. It is simply an information service to let you know when we publish new research. Now, when you came in this morning, you got a USB drive. And on that USB drive is every publication that we've had so far, and a number of charts that give you a lot of information on our research, on our households, on their earning, savings, spending, borrowing behavior. By no means is that the end. That is just the beginning. But that's there because we want you to be able to take a look at that, understand it, and start using it as you see connections to your work from what we've done. So please then do sign up for those alerts so that you can see there's going to be a lot more coming out every month for the next year as we delve deeper into these questions. And some of what we hear today will be an influence as you give us feedback on what you hear and see on where we take this research next, because we have such a huge data set to explore. On that note, let me introduce Danielle Kurtzel then from Vox, the business and economics correspondent from Vox, who will be our moderator today.
Hi, I'm Danielle Kurtzel. Like I said, I'm from Vox. We just launched in April. If you haven't visited our site, please do. Shameless plug, but really, I'm excited to be here. I'm very excited to be here and to hear what our panelists have to say. Rachel and Jonathan and our panelists are some very intelligent individuals who have who've been working in this field for a while. And really, what excites me about this is that when Rachel and Jonathan first showed their data to me, I realized that this data covers all sorts of dimensions of the lives of working Americans, of lower and middle class Americans, that the data we get from the government, the things that we in the media doggedly report all the time, really don't cover. And how we think about these issues is a function of the kind of data we have. So really to see these sorts of new dimensions, I think is very exciting, and I'm really excited to see what else they come up with in their research. So enough about what I think about this. A few quick housekeeping things before we start. The way this is going to happen is Jonathan and Rachel are going to present their findings. While they present, there will be people coming up and down the aisles and getting those question cards from you. Feel free to submit questions now. And then after that, I'll ask some of those questions to them, and then we'll bring the panelists on stage and have a Q&A with them. Jonathan and Rachel will join, and to finish off, we'll have a live Q&A with microphones, so you can ask any remaining questions at that time. So It should be a great morning, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan and Rachel. Jonathan Morduch is a professor of public policy and economics at NYU. Rachel Schneider is a senior vice president at the Center for Financial Services Innovation, and they're the co-principal investigators on the U.S. Financial Diaries. So take it away.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. Yeah, do you want to get started?
Yes.
So I want to reiterate something that Tim said and emphasize it. The funders on this project were much more than financial support, although of course without their funding this could not have happened. But they were very much thought partners along the way, both in thinking of the project in the first place, but also in thinking through what we're learning and what we're interested in learning from this work. And we also had the benefit of an extraordinary national advisory board, a few members of which are here today, and we really have benefited from their insights and the partnership of local community organizations as we talked to households and gathered and invited households to participate. So this was very much a group effort. I am personally deeply gratified to have been part of it, and on behalf of CFSI, we're really just complimented and enthused to have been part of this work and to keep seeing it through over the next few years as we continue to talk about what we've learned.
It's been a big project, a hard project. It's been lots of support. I also just want to make sure that we just call out Amy Brown at Ford Foundation has been a big part of this process as well. Thank you, Amy. When Rachel and I have been undertaking this project, it's been interesting. It's been a national shift in concerns, sort of an awakening, I think, to a broader set of tensions, especially after the Great Recession. But now we're seeing these are tensions that have been running through America for the last few decades. And it's hard to talk about, it's hard to talk about slides without slides. Let me hand this to somebody and I will just talk. It's hard to talk about inequality and mobility today without reference to one of the big texts which is shaping how we think about inequality, and that's Thomas Piketty's Capital, surprise bestseller of 2014. And Thomas did something really important. Piketty did something really important, which was to put together data, which helped us see the long swing and helped us see transitions and changes in America that have been happening really over the last century. But what's been really striking is that from 1970 to 2010, there's been this great increase in wealth at the very, very top. And we all know that, and we're talking about it and trying to sort out what it means. I think what Rachel and I have been trying to piece together is one part of what's happening to the part that isn't in the top 10%, maybe the bottom 70, 80%, that are not represented in the aggregate data, the annual data. While Piketty's been showing these big changes at the high end, there have been these fundamental changes that we're also paying attention to in labor markets, in manufacturing, and the service sector. And that part is harder to see in terms of what's going on in people's lives in the actual sort of day-to-day experiences of households. And that's really a big part of why we started this project.
So related to that was this intuition that life is lived day to day, month to month is how people think about their finances. And for the most part, what we have to work with is annual data, which makes it really hard to see that day-to-day challenge. The reason we have annual data is that we tend to think about finance in a life cycle approach. We think about what people need when they graduate from college, how much money they need to generate a down payment on a house, what is required for retirement. So we think about these big chunks that people need, and we think about them usually over the course of the life cycle, and we have this sort of idealized image that people will work at a stable job over time and steadily sock away savings for a series of big investments. And we wanted to get underneath that and see what was happening in between those big life cycle moments. And that was really the inspiration behind the diaries. as it was done abroad as is being done here. We wanted to be able to get within this larger life cycle transition. And so we put together a research study where we gathered just an immense amount of granular data. The goal was to work with 235 households and to collect as much information as we could. We tried to gather every single dollar that was earned, saved, spent, borrowed, given. We tried to track both in-kind and financial resources. We tracked whether it was conveyed electronically or in person, cash versus using an account of some kind. And over the course of the study, we also layered on 7 additional modules where we asked other questions around aspirations, around how you use financial services products and why, in order to get a really granular understanding of people's financial lives. The households that we worked with, they differ in some important ways. So about a third of them are below the poverty line, about a third are just above, and a third would be called middle class. The households are scattered across 4 different regions of the US. So we knew we couldn't do this sort of intensive research in a nationally representative way. This was individual field researchers going to talk one-on-one with families. And so we needed geographic concentration. But we thought we could capture the American experience by capturing specific archetypes within it. So across this sample, you have big urban populations, small city, suburban, rural. You have very different state regulatory environments, very different state economies, very different state financial services structures. And so we thought we would be able to capture enough about what people are experiencing that we'd be able to see whether or not there was common threads, even though each population really was quite distinct. So for example, in New York, we're working with a Bangladeshi community. In Queens, we're working with a Colombian community. In California, we are working more with a Mexican-American community. Right? So there's significant distinctions that matter, and we wanted to see if there were nonetheless common threads across the experience of these families. We collected about 300,000 individual data points of cash flows over the course of the study, and about 460,000 other answers to survey questions. So the volume of data has been immense. And that was necessary in order to do something that was at the core of this study from the get-go. What we wanted to do was expand the scope of how we think about financial health and about how we think about what matters in people's financial lives. So we've long thought about income, right? Whether or not people have enough to cover their life, sort of the backbone of thinking about equality in our country and thinking about whether or not we're providing a fair living experience for our full society. Over the last 2 decades, we've expanded that way of thinking to include an understanding that wealth also matters, that assets matter, and the other side of the balance sheet, liabilities, obviously matters. And it was our instinct that cash flows, that the way that money moves through a family over time, probably also mattered. And that this research methodology in particular would help us to see how it matters and why it matters and how it interacts with the other 2 elements that we already have been focusing on, income and wealth.
So one of the key parts of the methodology was to create a sample that was big enough to capture a variety of different experiences that are typical of how households are living today, but at the same time small enough for us to really get to know households and spend time with them. So I want to follow on from what Rachel said by introducing a few households and give you a sense of what they've been going through in the year that we got to know them. The first household is the Garzas. Daniela and Ricardo Garza, they live in Northern California. They're of Mexican heritage. They are working hard to raise a 3-year-old son. Ricardo's a construction worker, and he's got a very steady job, $400 a week, every week. And you can see that in the darker blue line right at the bottom. But it's not enough to make ends meet. So Ricardo's also doing a side job. He's doing some work with a friend, helping remodel people's homes. That goes up and down, and you can start to see that as we look at their income over the year, which this chart is depicting, their income in total is moving up and down, even though the base job is very steady. The key thing with Ricardo and Daniela's life is that on average they look just great. If we just looked at annual data or total incomes, their income is sufficient to cover their expenses on average. They tend to keep their expenses around $2,500, $2,700. Their median monthly income is $2,800. But during the year, those ups and downs really matter, and they create pain. When the Garzas hit low points, and 1 month they were down as low as $1,600, and they had to turn to pawn shops. They had to turn to expensive ways to raise money. This is a story that we see again and again in our households, that it's not enough to have enough money in total. When you have it really matters critically. And so that's one story. Another of the households we got to know well is a woman named Sandra Young. She lives in Brooklyn, close to where our offices are. Sandra was born out west. She is from a military family. She is an amazing budgeter. She showed us this Excel spreadsheet she has where she tracks everything she spends and earns every day. She checks it and rechecks it and really keeps within an amazingly tight budget. But she does that because her life is full of ups and downs. She's in the tax preparation business. She earns most of her money in the beginning of the year, as you'd imagine. So she needs to budget so that she can spread things over to the end of the year. That's an extreme case of a spike. But we see these ups and downs in lots of other places too. The Johnsons in Ohio. They're a family living near Cincinnati. They look like they're doing pretty well, and they are doing pretty well. They've got a home they own. They've got a 2-car garage. They're just doing fine, it looks like, but they have no cushion. They're piecing together 9 different income sources in order to make things meet, and they're going up and down. The Hosseins in Queens, it's a family, came from Bangladesh a while back. They're on the rise. Both of them are working. They have a young son. They've been switching jobs, trying to improve life. They were working in a dry goods store, then at a check casher. Then Ahmed Hussein started driving a taxi. He's doing a little bit better now. But all of those shifts bring dislocations and disjunctures, and we see that in spikes of income through the year. So moving up also means taking on more ups and downs. And finally, Tim and Clara Adrian in Mississippi. Their family working hard. Tim's working in a hotel. Clara teaches preschool. But one of the things that they're committed to and that they've been trying to do over the last few years is build a family through taking in foster children. They've got 2 teenage girls, and they've got the 5-year-old brother of the 2 teenage girls. To make it all work, they get payments from the government to pay for the fostering costs. But those payments from the government are unreliable and also lead to spikes in their income, which create real stresses and challenges for the Adrians. And so these ups and downs that we see, both on the income side and the spending side, become characteristic of a lot of what we've seen in the Diaries families. So to step back and then see the bigger sample, we start with median income, right, across the year. When we talk about spikes and dips, we've been defining them as an amount that's greater than 25% of the median, or a dip would be under 25% of the median. And so we have these spikes and we have these dips. So how frequent are they? To give a sense of it, we find that on average, households are facing 4 spikes and dips over the year. That's on average 2 up and 2 down. Some less, or some more, but they're facing substantial volatility. And it's happening mainly because of labor market issues. Work hours, going up and down, not getting the overtime you want, sometimes getting overtime, and that's a real benefit, but a lack of steadiness on the employment side. Also seeing, just like with the Adrians, lumpy benefits, lumpy money coming in, which is a real benefit when it happens when you want it to happen and know it's going to happen. It also creates problems when it's delayed, so the timing's off. Health problems are a big part of the story. Our sample is before Obamacare. So it would be interesting to go back and see now how things have gone since the changes with the Affordable Care Act. But in our sample, health problems have been a real issue and emergencies that come up. But in many ways, a bigger issue is predictable problems that nonetheless arise. You may not know when they're going to happen. You may not know how big a problem they're going to be. But you can imagine that at some point your car is going to need some work, or you're going to have a child care issue if you're in that situation. And those kinds of issues are also hitting the households. And the final thing is we see a fair amount of movement in and out of the households. And that movement tends to be a strain on families. And so as Rachel and I think about what's really going on, it's ups and downs. But it's not just ups and downs, it's a mismatch. It's a mismatch of timing such that you may have a great income spike, but it's not happening when you have the need to spend, or vice versa. So we find that 39% of the time, those income needs and spending needs, or income needs and spending needs, are happening at the same time. Right? And it may be because when people have money, they spend. Or it may be that when they need to spend, they work extra hard to have the money. But 39% of the time, things are aligned and things are going well. But 61% of the time, the rest of the time, they're not. And a quarter of the time, those spending needs are happening when income is below the median. And that's where the real pressure happens. And so it's not surprising, given that nearly all of our households have months where their spending is greater than their income. One way to see that is by thinking about changes from month to month in people's income. And so this is drops in month-to-month income by 25%. And we're seeing across our sample, this is from the poorest to the best off. As Rachel was saying, about a third of our samples below the poverty line, about a third of our samples middle income, and a third is right in between. And we're seeing drops, on average, by 25% from month to month, happening about 1 in 4 months, or 1 in 5 months on average. But there's good news in a sense. They're not just drops. The other part of the story is upswings, right? They're ups and downs. And those are also happening across the board, about 1 in 4 months. The challenge for the households is to take advantage of the upswings and cope with the drops. And both turn out to be challenging. So a way to see what Rachel and I are starting to sort of find in the data is that, as Rachel was saying, our conversations have been very focused on income and wealth, right? Two big challenges for working Americans. But we see another challenge which is wrapped in with those, and that's an inequality in access to steady, reliable, predictable earnings and finances. And that then shades how we understand what households are doing and where they're heading.
Thanks, Sean. So several national studies have asked this question. What would you prefer, financial stability or moving up the income ladder? And when the Pew Charitable Trust asked this question, 85% of people in a national sample said financial security. I think this is because people are experiencing what we've just described, and they're reporting back that it's a real problem for them. Within our sample, the numbers are similar, although in the lower incomes end of our sample, of course, it shifts a bit, right? So for people who are poorer, 31% are saying that they would prefer to move up the income ladder. But even then, 65% are saying what they really want is more stability. Now, of course, these are intertwined, right? More income is going to lead to more stability, one would hope. But I think that the reason why people prioritize stability is that's the core need. That's what they're actually aiming for. And they are seeing that even when they have a middle-class level of income or a total amount of income that might work over a longer period of time, there's often near-term disruption. So a lot of the ways we think about dealing with this, we just think are insufficient. Financial literacy and budgeting, nudges, they're all important, but they're not going to do the full job. And part of why they're not is just the math is too hard. I mean, I think about a family like the Garzas, and I think level of certainty that they would have to be able to predict their finances with just doesn't exist. There are too many unknowns, and it's really hard to factor those into your planning. And even if you do, it takes an incredible amount of time and energy, and that's bandwidth that could be dedicated elsewhere. So it's not the most productive use of their time, and it's really hard to do well. So what do we need? You know, part of this is just structural. It's the nature of how our economy is today. And so it's impossible to look at this picture and not think about those structural issues, about the need for good jobs that provide stable incomes over time. But I also think that something Jonathan said is worth emphasizing here, which is that part of what we're seeing is a result of a structural shift that's unlikely to go backward in time. So some people are saying this is the biggest change in our economy since the Industrial Revolution. Right? We're now in a moment where people expect to have multiple jobs over the course of their lives. There's an increase in part-time work. It's a moment where Uber is displacing taxi drivers, right? And that is, there are benefits to that, and many of us are experiencing those, but we're also, all of us can experience in our professional lives some disruption as a result. And as a result of that, all workers are going to need new ways to enhance their control of their finances and build resilience over time. So how do you deal with that, right? If our traditional way of thinking about finances is a series of long-term, is preparing for a series of long-term goals, in some ways the way we've been thinking is as though people are thinking about now and they're thinking about later. And the reality is that people are thinking about 3 time zones. They're thinking about now, later, and soon. They're thinking about what's going to happen in the next year to 2 years. And how do you plan for the next 3 to 6 months sometimes, right? And so our first thought's going to be, well, let's save our way out of this, right? That's sort of an obvious answer. If people had cushion, none of this would be a problem. And the answer there is that we do see savings. But part of why we don't usually see it is that, again, our model for thinking about savings is missing a piece. So we tend to think about the distinction between spending now and saving for later. And when we don't see enough long-term savings having been accumulated, we assume people are overspending. But the reality is that what people are doing is they're saving for soon. And that's what we see in our data. So we asked people when they expected to spend the funds in their checking and savings accounts. Part of the instinct behind this question was that we wondered if people actually use their financial accounts in the way we've defined them to be. So is checking really just for transactions? Is savings really for savings? And if you define savings as near-term, intra-year spending, then the answer would be yes, right? But if you're going to view savings as only for the long term, well then only about 23% of the savings in people's accounts is expected to be used in a time period of 3 years out, right? The rest of it's going to get spent sooner. There is a difference, though, between checking versus savings. So 92% of savings is expected to be spent within the year, whereas only 61% of savings. So there's a difference here, but it's not necessarily the savings the way we thought of it as being. You also see that in this chart. So what this is showing is along the x-axis is the year-end balance that's accumulated in checking or savings account. And then the y-axis is showing the amount of dollars flowing through an account. So it's really showing the ratio between the dollars coming through an account over time relative to the total accumulation. And this cluster of dots around a 50-to-1 ratio is basically saying that lots of families have 50 times more dollars flowing through their accounts over the course of a year than they accumulate at the end. Right? So there's capacity here. There's intra-year spending, intra-year accumulation. They're just not long-term accumulation. And families recognize this. So they see that they're saving. On average, we had a $1,500 balance for emergency savings. But they report wanting to have a much larger balance, wanting to have $8,000 on average. And so this gap often gets filled by credit. And our instinct is to think credit's always bad, savings always good. I don't think that's what our data is showing. But we are seeing that 55% of the sample is using credit cards. And within that sample, a significant number are not paying in full and are carrying a balance over time. Interestingly, about 32% of the sample is using payday, pawn, the small dollar credit products that we tend to worry a lot about. We don't see a ton of this activity in our sample. For us, the second most common activity is really borrowing among friends and family, this 41% bar. Some of that's the size of our sample. Some of that is where our sample is. But we have thought, as we talked about this, Jonathan and I, that the importance of informal finance is a crucial learning from this work. The extent to which people's finances are intertwined with their family and friends is important as we think about policy solutions, as we think about product design. And so we spent a lot of time looking at the informal borrowing and lending part of our data. And there's a few things worth pointing out. One is this isn't a story of one family member always struggling and therefore always borrowing from somebody else. 20% of the sample is both borrowing and lending. So this is a story of resources being exchanged as much as anything else. And there's some real advantages. There's some real advantages of this. People report the ease and access, right? You don't fill out an application of any sort. It's usually really fast. It's low cost because you're unlikely to be paying significant, if any, interest. And mostly what people talk about is repayment flexibility. If they don't have the funds today, they'll be able to repay later. But people also see a significant downside here. And this quote from Sandy in Ohio really encapsulates it. She says, "I took off today because stress is too high. I was going to borrow $200 from a friend and it fell through. I truly need it. I want to cry and I can't. I need it before the month is out. I had it and I lent it to my family and I'm catching hell getting it back." So the overall borrowing capacity of this kind of lending, right, is capped by the lending capacity of the community. And that's a real challenge. And the reciprocity that people experience when they're borrowers and lenders is both a positive and a negative. So sometimes you hear people talking about how it adds to their life to be interconnected. It builds their emotional connections to others and gives them a sense of purpose and contribution. But there is also a very real risk for people when they're so intertwined. The loans that we see vary in size. About 50% of them are in this 100 to 500 range. It really corresponds to the gaps that we know exist in the supply of high quality, affordable, small dollar credit. There are two other ways that we see people using, having financial behaviors that operate as credit. So almost half of the population that we worked with had at least one overdraft, which is really a way that people are balancing against the mismatch that Jonathan has described. And the second thing that we see people doing is juggling their bills. So about a third of the bills that we tracked were paid on time, but about a quarter are being paid late. And I think a lot of this behavior is intentional. It's the juggling that comes with a known mismatch.
So what do households need? And what are households doing? So what we see households really needing are, one, ways to deal with just day-to-day financial management. Two, there are emergencies, unusual things that happen. You need ways to deal with them. They're often big and urgent. And the third is putting together lump sums for important expenses that you know are going to happen. They're not emergencies, but they're big ticket items, and they're hard to pay for. Those are the basic tools. So what are households actually doing to piece things together to make it happen? I want to focus a bit on some of the saving strategies. We see a fundamental balance that households are really trying to achieve. And behavioral economics, with its focus on psychology and structures, helped us see part of what's going on. That households, like all of us, have a hard time saving, and it's often very helpful to have some structure to keep us sort of going forward and keep us on the right path. So structure is very important. And yet what the US diaries are showing is that there's this other side, which is the ups and downs mean that that too much structure can be a real problem. It can be extremely costly, and so there's this balance between structure and flexibility that the households are really trying to navigate. Too much structure is a problem, too little structure is a problem, too much flexibility is a problem, too little flexibility is a problem. And that's really the story. And we see people then resolving it lots of ways. And one of them is by departing from how we usually think about saving behavior, which is usually a very individual mode. We usually think about people on their own trying to figure out how they can put money aside and save. What we see people often doing, though, is looking to others, outsiders, to help them save through providing support. One of the outsiders is a parent. We often find that people say, you know, I'm saving with my mother. So we met a young man, who's actually not that young, he's 50. I'm showing my age. Definitely young. In Brooklyn, he's sleeping on his mother's couch because he's saving up for a down payment to get his own apartment. Right? He's banked, but he's saving with her. He's giving money to her, his mother, to put money in her account because his mother will take the money, keep it locked up, but will know when he actually needs to take it out for some other purpose. She can be a gatekeeper that helps him move forward. So saving alone is not always the best strategy, and we see these kinds of strategies in lots of ways. Another mode, we often talk about saving and teach saving as something we do slowly and steadily and accumulate with discipline over time. That's sort of the turtle mode, right? We'll eventually get there, just do it, and if you have enough time, you will get to your goal. So what we often see then to sort of build some structure into that is households create habits. So Katerina, a woman we met, one of the poorest members of our sample, lives in Queens. She puts aside $1 a day. It's a habit, and that's sort of special to her, $1 a day, and she's got it targeted for paying a cable bill that's important to her, a phone bill. But one of the tensions is Katerina knows that that can work for that bill, but it can't work for the rest of her life. The rest of her life's a little bit haywire, the rest of her finances. But the $1 a day, the slow accumulation, can work for some parts of some people's lives. But what was striking, and which really departs from the sort of steady and slow accumulation, was that some of our most effective savers in the sample are not doing it slowly and steadily. They're doing it fast, and they're doing it intensively. They're saving in a sprint. Often they're getting together with friends, and they're forming a saving club, particularly in immigrant communities, forming a savings club where they're all agreeing to save and put money into a pot that they each can get a share of at some point. I was just talking to a woman last week who is saving up to make a car down payment. She works in a bakery. She's together with 13 other women in the bakery. They're each putting in $100 a week. And so over 13 weeks, she put together $1,300. She said, Jonathan, I need to now complete that payment. Next time I'm going to do this, I'm going to put $200 in. So she's going to get $2,600 in 13 weeks. She can't do that all the time, but this is a case where the hare beats the tortoise. So often saving fast and intensively. One of our households said, this process for him was sacred. Sacred. Nothing is more important than making those payments. So you can do it some of the time, not all the time, but it's what our most effective savers are doing, and it's very different from how we usually talk about saving. The last element, and this really comes from the ups and downs, is spikes, right? Those spikes. They're positive, they're good, if you can get hold of them. So some of our most effective savers also are grabbing the spikes. They're not saving the rest of the year. They're not slowly and steadily accumulating. They're just waiting until there's a moment where they can get that extra money. It's often a tax refund, but there are other spikes. Protect it and get it into the bank or use it for a big expense. These are the kinds of strategies that households are using today, relying on to navigate. And that navigation is important and hard to see. It was a real privilege for Rachel and I to get to spend time with households, see their data, see their lives, sit in their living rooms and talk about strategies. We see it by focusing not just on income and assets, but also on cash flows. So with cash flows, that we see the navigation, we see the strategy, we see dynamism that you can't see by just looking at balances. It's also a place where we see failures. It's a place where we see mistakes. It's a place where we see stresses. So in closing, just a few thoughts. We've just reiterated a few things that Rachel said and then a few broader thoughts. Very briefly. I think one of the most striking things that Rachel and I saw was that a lot of what looked like bugs in the system, like people running these overdrafts, you think these are all mistakes, turn out to be features of the system. They're often deliberate, they're choices. Be choices weighed against paying a bill late or going to an expensive lender or going to your brother for the 4th time for a loan. So they're often features of the system, not bugs. And it's overdrafts, it's informal loans, late bills. One of the things which is key about the informal side is that all of the households, almost all of them that were engaged in these informal activities, they have banks. They are banked, but they're also choosing to do this. As Rachel was saying, low savings balances, which has been a big focus, does not mean reckless spending and does not mean people aren't saving or involved in saving activities. It really changes how we think about what people are doing. Financial literacy, which is another big focus of policy, doesn't line up very well with the skills that people really need, or doesn't say much about the skills people really need to navigate and manage and get through the year. Families do have solutions, and we started to see some of them where I'm starting to understand more of them. They often involve other people, family and friends. That's not the way we usually think about people's finances, but it is the way that people are navigating. And I think as we sort of go back to thinking about the broader frame and different kinds of inequalities, this is one, unlike the others, where financial tools really can make a big difference. These are hard problems, but they tend to be more solvable, or we can see solutions more easily than some of the other issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why Rachel and I feel much more optimistic about this set of issues. Volatility and these mismatches, they are really important features of today's economy for most working Americans. It's not just our data. We see it in news reports. We see it in various studies of different kinds. Our study, I think, is special by bringing the household perspective and really seeing how it connects through people's lives across a year. But dealing with those ups and downs, we're also seeing is stressful. It diverts resources. It's very, very difficult, and it doesn't always work. And we really see people, when things are failing, really start to slide. On the other hand, being able to manage these mismatches can be a key to moving forward. So I think as Rachel and I understand the families, get to know them, hear their stories, hear their own concerns, come to see, like the results of the Pew survey that Rachel was describing, that reducing instability is a goal in itself. No matter what other connections it leads to, it's a goal in itself. It's a real problem. It weighs on people, and it's been hard to see, and we don't really have the policies and products that can help people maximally deal with it. I think the big question, and this is one that Rachel and I think people more broadly are focused on and trying to sort out, is how instability, these kinds of ups and downs, how they connect to these other issues that we as a society are grappling with. How they tie to mobility, how they tie to inequality, how they tie to economic growth. We only have a small group of households. We've got to know them really well. We've learned a lot. But in many ways, I think what Rachel and I are trying to do is also help open up a conversation about how these pieces connect. So as a society, we can move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're sitting here for questions.
Okay. I'm on right now. But all right, so we have some really good questions that we've collected from the audience. That was fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to start with one that actually apparently I'm on the same wavelength as one of our people here because I was wondering about this myself, a sort of current events question. San Francisco, I'm sure you saw a week or two ago, passed what they called the Workers' Bill of Rights, which in part said, an employer has to give you X amount of advance notice before they, shift your schedule around too much. So, what do you think about policies like that? Even if it doesn't necessarily give a person more income, it at least allows them to plan at least a couple of weeks in advance. What sort of effect do you think that could have, given the research you've done?
Yeah, I think that could be really positive. I do think that workers have very little control. Right, they're the sellers in this environment, and for the most part, don't have the negotiating ability to set that up with their boss one-on-one.
Right.
And so there is a moment here where we may need government action.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the stress is, so one of the things is we see households, we're not just looking through the lens of a particular job. They've got 3 jobs going on perhaps, and the husband or wife's job, or the boyfriend or girlfriend, there's a lot going on in the household, and childcare. And so that instability has these ripple effects that are hard to see. So often just helping get one part more stable can help all the other pieces work much better.
And you mentioned husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, and this is something that I can't help but think about when I hear this, which is, of course, we all know single parenthood, single motherhood in particular has grown in the U.S. In your sample, in your research, did you see big differences between 2-earner households and 1-earner households in this kind of volatility?
There are big differences
Yeah.
when we don't control for other aspects.
Sure.
I think the
Sure.
big story is that even the traditional nuclear family, right, the Garzas or the Johnsons that we were seeing, who look very stable, are not very stable. And so I think the bigger story to us is that the differences aren't so pronounced. If you're a single parent, of course, you've got more stresses with childcare and such, and you're really leaning on your community in much deeper ways than the kinds that we describe.
Yeah, I think another part of the story is that the ways that families organize their finances vary considerably. So even a 2-income family, a married couple, might not be fully sharing their finances. Or we met multi-generational families where some generations were only contributing to big expenses, but other than that, their earnings were for their own savings. So the financial arrangements that people make with each other vary.
Gotcha. One question, a very, very simple question we have is, what impact will higher minimum wages have? I mean, it doesn't perhaps change the volatility, but does giving someone a few more bucks in their paycheck at least help them to get through those dips? Or is it, or do you consider that insufficient to really help with this sort of thing?
So I think it does help, right? So an underlying part of what we talked about is that the ups and downs matter in part because people don't have a cushion, right? So the more the ups and downs can happen at a higher level, the more likely it is that they can build a cushion over time and bolster their own ability to manage against the volatility they're experiencing.
Yeah, I think the minimum wage, together with some tools to help build the cushion, is more powerful than either the tools or the minimum wage.
Sure.
But you put them together, and that's much more powerful.
And maybe just to tack on to that, minimum wage is always talked about, especially here in Washington, in concert with the EITC. I mean, same question about that. I mean, that seems to me intuitively to be something that almost creates a certain amount of volatility. I mean, at the same time, it of course gives people more money. It creates a certain spike. I mean, so how effective do you think that is in helping low-income Americans?
Well, and a lot of people in this room have worked on EITC and how to maximize EITC. It is one of the largest spikes in income, and you see people plan around it. Knowing it's coming, they'll either forego large expenses or make large expenses, knowing they'll be able to then pay for them when they get that spike. It's not clear to me that families would prefer to have that smoothed out.
Sure.
There's a lot of benefit to the forced savings. In some ways, it's really an automated accumulation of a lump.
Sure.
And I think that has real benefits for people.
Yeah, I think, like we're saying, the needs people have of day-to-day management, dealing with emergencies, and building up lump sums. And the EITC is this beautiful feature for lots of families that just create that lump sum for people. It's really a substitute for a savings group in many ways, as Rachel's saying.
That's interesting. Okay, so one thing to shift gears a little bit here, you talked about the now and the soon. Let's talk about the later, which maybe we didn't get into quite as much. In terms of retirement, we have a question about, to what degree you studied retirement, and also to what degree are the people in your sample prepared for, decades down the road?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's a mixed bag. This is a hard one. We go back. We're laughing because we go back and forth around it. We see folks trying to build up retirement saving and then finding they need to pull money out. And there's been a lot of reporting around pulling money out of 401ks.
Sure.
And so it's a tension for these families. They know they've got to do it, but they also know they need the here and now. I think our position, well, Rachel, speak on this too, but is that being able to save for retirement requires also being able to deal with the stuff that's happening within the year.
Sure.
And that part's being left out of policies, but could really be the foundation for more successful policies that work over the long term. So I guess one way to think about it is that thinking about retirement also means thinking about 2016 and 2017.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think, so I tend to think about it in terms of specific stories that we've heard from households, and a family that comes to mind is a family we've profiled that we call the Rodriguezes. And to us, it looked like they had sufficient instability in their future, because it's a family that has 5 income streams coming in, but one person in the family group was going to move out, so there's a loss of income there, and there's talk of a second one moving out. So again, a loss of income. And we looked at their expense base and said, well, when they've dropped from 3 sets of incomes to from 5 to 3, are they really going to still be able to cover their expenses? And we thought they looked precarious. And the head of household, it was nearing retirement, so that's why I think of it in that context.
Sure.
And I met with her recently, and she's now retired. And so now they have, her income switched from an income to what she'll get from Social Security. And her take on her security, her retirement security, was really full of agency that you couldn't see from just the data, right? I saw a lot of precariousness. What she saw was, if I have to sell my house and move to a cheaper house, I can sell my house and move to a cheaper house. I have a lot of options here. She said, I have part-time work, I'm incredibly employable. And she saw resources that we couldn't see. So I see that as a two-sided coin, right? There's agency and a willingness to be resourceful and creative and make her life work. There's also pretty clearly retirement insecurity that will require that. Right? So it's not an unequivocally positive storyline. I just think it's really complicated for people.
Sure. And I mean, we're talking about saving. Let's turn to debt a bit. I mean, you talk about these people borrowing money from each other, informal and formal loans that they're getting. What sort of trends did you see in people repaying their debt, doing it on time, and really being able to do it at all in some cases?
Well, you see a significant amount of, I'm struggling for the right word, a lack of specific knowledge about debt, right? So people can't necessarily report all their balances easily, which was a continual challenge in the research. So they have to dig deep to know exactly what they owe sometimes. Other people could list every single credit card. The Rodriguez family I was just describing, she knew every balance, every credit card. And part of why she felt secure as she entered retirement was she had been very religious about paying down all her credit cards and her home mortgage. So I don't know if that helps.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the things which was interesting was one of the things which Rachel had described, which is 55% of our households have credit cards. It means 45% of our households don't have credit cards.
Right.
And so they're not mired in credit card debt. Of the households with credit cards, about a third of them are maxed out, really having difficulty. So that is something we see. We see stresses in people overextended, and we do see some payday and pawn shops and all that. But it's not the situation for most of our households. Most of our households want to avoid fringe banking.
Sure.
They know the difficulty, they understand it, and they really are trying to keep it within bounds. And so the debt issue is, or the over-indebtedness issue is really located within a segment of our households. Most of the households seem to be balancing it
Right.
pretty well.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that in one pocket of the research sample, there was really savvy usage of debt. So one of the immigrant communities that we worked with clearly had lots of people who were marching through store credit to traditional credit cards in a conscious effort to build credit scores.
Right.
And so it was interesting to see that in some communities that was just sort of part of what you learned when you moved to this country.
And you've sort of anticipated my next follow-on question to this. Is, you know, you mentioned, what was it, 45% don't have credit cards?
Yes.
Did you see a lot of families who had difficulty building up a credit score? You know, like, is there a certain snowball effect to, I don't use a credit card, I have bad credit, it gets worse, etc.?
There is. I mean, we have to assume that some percentage of that 45% are people who had bad experiences in the past and are now intentionally off of credit.
Sure.
People who, right, so you know, Sandra Young, who Jonathan mentioned, had gone through bankruptcy well before our study. So she's done, right? She will not go near it. So there's certainly some of that.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about the experience that Rachel was describing is in the Bangladeshi community, in particular in Queens, you know, part of what it means when you come to America is start learning about credit scores and building it up. It was striking that while that was working so well in that community, it wasn't the norm in other communities.
Sure.
And you know, it goes outside of what our studies set up to really understand. But clearly some households are very focused on credit scores, some are not, and they're paying the price.
Gotcha. And one big question I have is, you know, this is, of course, your preliminary, your early findings. What more do you want to get out of this project? What are your, you know, major goals for the future of it?
Do you want to start?
I feel like this could be a long answer.
They're big. You know, these are really the fundamentals.
Sure.
I think we're ready to share this day with you because I think we really think that we've seen the basic patterns. We know the families quite well. You know, what I think Rachel and I want to do from this point forward is start weaving the story and telling it in a way that pulls all the strands together. There are pieces that we want to understand better. The data we have on bill paying is really interesting. We see all the bills, every single bill that people owe, whether they pay it on time, when they pay it, whether it's late. Digging into those kinds of decisions will help us understand a whole series of other kinds of choices.
Yeah, so you'll see us put out more issue briefs like we've done so far to delve into specific issues like bill pay or like how health interacts with people's finances. Our focus in the last few months has really been in trying to understand the big picture, how it all fits together, and that's been exciting. We think we've reached a milestone there, but there's a lot more to do to keep digging into what we see in particular parts of the sample and particular parts of the data set.
And one of the big things is health, right? That we've set aside because it's complicated, but we see that financial stresses are often tied to health stresses, and that solving the financial stresses often allow you to go to the doctor and pay for the prescriptions and do all that. And we really see connections that are sometimes hard to see in the usual ways that we're looking at the issue. So that's one of the big next steps.
I see. That's interesting. So in a certain sense then, this is something that, to be honest, even looking at your data, I hadn't thought of, but is there a sort of public health side to financial instability where improving health outcomes, improving health in communities can broadly improve their economic well-being? Or their stability of expenses.
I mean, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the things we see is a lot of non-compliance on the health side because of the financial side. So we see a lot of pill cutting, not taking all your prescriptions, buying prescriptions from other sources which are less reliable. But the other side is true also, that the public health interventions can help the financial interventions, and that can then have spillovers to other choices households make. The foods they can purchase, the resources they can put into their kids, etc.
I see. Gotcha.
At least that's the hypothesis.
Right. And one other question I have is, like I mentioned in introducing you, this is data unlike, a lot that I have ever had the pleasure of working with. and just sort of seeing the day-to-day lives of people's finances, because we all live day to day, not year to year. And I guess I wonder who else out there is doing research in this area that you think is promising? What other good places are there to see this in action?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a lot of great organizations which are looking at slices of this.
Sure.
So the Federal Reserve has now started a series of studies. They did the first one that came out this year from 2013 called the Survey of Household Economic Decision Making, I believe, which asks questions now for the first time on month-to-month ups and downs. And it looks, in a national sample, thousands and thousands of households, and it looks a lot like what we're seeing. And they're going to continue doing it through this conversation.
Sure.
Pew, the Urban Institute, a lot of the organizations in Washington are starting to move this way. And the broader asset building communities, been trying to focus on long-term saving, is also coming and saying, look, we need to pay more attention to emergency savings and other coping mechanisms.
Right. Yeah, I also think the work coming out of the CFPB on financial well-being and the other work that CFSI is doing on financial health is related, because often those national surveys are asking questions about how people manage their day-to-day cash flow and whether or not they're experiencing volatility in a way that's complementary to the Fed's recent SHED survey. We get questions all the time from people who want to replicate this sort of in-depth, deep dive into people's finances.
Right.
And I think there's appetite to do more of that work. It's logistically, operationally, financially really hard and really complicated, which gives me a nice opportunity to acknowledge some of the people in the room without whom it would not have been doable. Right, so Nancy Castillo at the back managed this from the beginning on a day-to-day basis and recruited 12 field researchers. It was really a big undertaking to go figure out where to do the research and hire people in those locations, gather all this data. That's the piece that's really hard. Sure. Julie Sawicki, who's in the back, is one of the field researchers and is now at FAI. Joanne, next to her, has been instrumental in every element of the administrative workings. And Tim, who started us off today, has really been crucial in making this work. So you need a team that's willing to invest over the course of several years. I think there's real promise in thinking of smaller, easier ways to do a similar dive. And when we get questions from organizations across the country who want to do something similar, what I say to them is, you don't necessarily need a year. You don't necessarily need to go and ask every single thing we ask in order to keep developing this body of understanding. And so I hope people will take up that mantle and keep gathering cash flow related data.
Gotcha. All right, well, I would like to keep us on schedule here. And really, that's, I think, most of the questions we have. So thank you to you both. And yeah, everybody, let's thank them.